Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on Truth and Reconciliation for CUPE members. This is a really important topic for us, especially given the events over the last several months. And we also know it's a vital topic for CUPE members as well, because we've had over 250 CUPE members registered for this event from across the country. We're really delighted with this response. I'm your host tonight, and my name is Dana Wesley. I'm a member of Moose Cree First Nation. I'm also the Senior Officer, Indigenous Issues in the Human Rights Branch at CUPE National. I'm currently speaking from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the traditional Indigenous territories that everyone is coming from today. I'm honored to be hosting today's important discussion. But before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping details. Please note that this event will be recorded for future educational purposes. Also, sign language interpretation and live captioning is available. So to access the captioning, click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom viewer. And the sign language interpretation is already spotlighted on the screen. Also, you may hear periodically their voices from time to time, just to let us know if we might need to slow down. And finally, a big thank you to our sign language interpreters and live captionists for their vital role in making this event as accessible as possible. And now I'm really happy to say that CUPE's National President, Mark Hancock, and CUPE's National Secretary Treasurer, Charles Fleury, are here to provide some opening words and introduce our elder. I believe that Charles is starting, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Dana. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm in Ottawa today on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm glad to be here tonight, and I thank all of you for making the time to participate in this important conversation. I also want to thank the members of our National Indigenous Council, and especially our staff for their work in organizing this event. And now our National President has a few words to say before he introduce our first guest. Mark?
Great, thanks, Charles. I'm joining you tonight from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the home of the Kwikwetlem. My friends, this year has been a challenging one, especially when it comes to reconciliation. Since the first unmarked graves were found in British Columbia this summer, more and more have been recovered all across the country. CUPE is mourned alongside our Indigenous members and communities. We understand that this is a very difficult time for many. CUPE remains committed to reconciliation. We continue to call on all levels of governments in Canada to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And we have clear direction from our delegates at national conventions to work towards reconciliation as a union. Tonight is an opportunity to continue our national conversation on reconciliation. It is critical that we learn about the truth part of truth and reconciliation. This is what Indigenous peoples have asked us to do. As CUPE leaders and activists, we need to make time to educate ourselves and our members. And we are very grateful to our speaker tonight for helping us with that learning. To get us started, I'd like to introduce our elder, Thomas Lutitit. Thomas was born in Coral Rapids, Ontario. He is the second oldest of 9 children. Thomas spent his early years in Moose Factory. When he was 5 years old, he was sent to the Fort Albany Indian Residential School, and at 9 to the Fort George School in Quebec. Thomas describes himself as Oskabewis, a helper to the people. For almost 10 years, Thomas has been the elder for CUPE's National Indigenous Council. We have come to trust and depend on his wisdom in our work at CUPE. Thank you, Thomas. I'll turn it over to you now.
Hey, what you? We're taking up here, distant cars, more so, do them. Give me the good hand, I'll stay more, get you a bit up, man. Bukuman, she's a cascatayan, a little buyana, on the book, and she's done. Cake shape, and we jogging, we top mark and they will eat the mic. Make what's on the dog, is having a third to be negative, get you a bit of cusconess. Mina giche bagnes motte ano tenne kawi kaski. Alderman Sonny, how? Bukan ka betaman ang giwasya ka chick. It's very hard for me to speak at times when the world was awakened by finding of these young ones. They could have been my age sitting beside me. They could have been there with me. But I was fortunate that I'm able to come home during the 10 months that I was there for over 10 years. I thank the Creator for that. But I pray for other parents that their child never came home. It is really hard for us. Us survivors have been there. We know what happened to us. We felt those pain. Then later we got angry as we grew up. There was nobody there at that time to help us. We were never taught to be asked to ask for help. We're never taught that way. They were just told what to do. They never say thank you and I love you. But today I have 19 grandchildren and 3 great-granddaughters. I hug them dearly. And I could say to them, I love them so dearly. And to you people that are here, I thank you for being here. To educate these people a little bit. It's very important for us, your educated people, are to help us in that way. Many of us survivors never had that education. And I thank you for doing this for the people and for me and my grandchildren. Thank you.
Miigwech. Thank you so much, Thomas, for those opening words. I know your words mean a lot to all of us. And thank you also to our national officers for joining us as well. And hello again to everyone who is following along. And for those of you who have just joined us, I'm Dana Wesley from CUPE National's Human Rights Branch, and I'll be hosting this webinar. I just want to quickly introduce our speakers. We have 3 with us today. John Brady McDonald is our Senior Officer of CUPE Saskatchewan's Indigenous Council Committee. We also have Deborah Merrier, the Diversity Vice President, Indigenous Workers from CUPE National Executive Board. And finally, we have Dr. Nigon Sinclair, Assistant Professor at the University of Manitoba. Thank you to you all for being here. And before we get started, I want to let our audience know that we will have a question and answer period at the end of the discussion. So feel free to submit your questions at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The format that this discussion will follow is that I will ask each speaker a question and let them answer first, and then the other panelists are welcome to join in as well. But for the sake of time, I won't go into details today about everyone's bios, but I want to let viewers know that they can still go and read them on the landing page for the event. So please feel free to go check that out. You'll also notice that the chat is turned off for this event. This is because we want to make sure that we create a space in a good way for what people are sharing tonight. What you will see in the chat is our team sharing resources on how members can support reconciliation efforts within our union. Okay, let's begin. We've got our first question here for John Brady McDonald. You have been recognized for many of your talents as a musician, an artist, a poet, and a historian. And today you are bringing the perspective of a union activist in your role of Senator of the CUPE Saskatchewan Indigenous Council Committee, but you're also bringing your perspective as a residential school survivor. So what do you think is important for our members to understand about how the legacy of residential schools impacts Indigenous workers, and how can the union offer support?
Thanks, everyone. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, my ancestral territory in northern Saskatchewan. As Dana mentioned, I am a residential school survivor. I attended the Prince Albert Indian Student Residence from 1984 to 1989. And when we talk about the legacy of residential schools, just the wording of that is kind of, it conjures up images, black and white images of long ago, of these brick buildings that happened 50, 60, 80 years ago. What I think is important is for our members to realize is that we're not ancient history. You know, the year I left residential school, the first episode of The Simpsons aired. The year the last residential school closed, NSYNC released their first album, and Friends was in their second or third season. So we aren't, you know, we're not ancient history. We're not black and white photographs. And my generation of residential school survivors one day we're going to be the last generation, the last living witnesses to what happened inside those buildings. I attended residential school. My sisters attended residential school. My parents, uncles and aunties, all of them on both sides attended residential school. My grandmother attended residential school. My children are the first generation in 4 to have never known the inside of a residential school. And what union members, if we can instill in our union members, is that recognition that it's still happening. You know, we're still here. We're not black and white photographs. We're not the stories of our grandparents are not the only ones. And what we as a union, what I hope that as a union we can accomplish is providing better for Indigenous members of our community, restoring some of those connections that were broken. In particular, I'll give an example. In many collective bargaining agreements for bereavement leave, they are geared not towards Indigenous people in terms of our kinship relationships. Many, if you're going for bereavement leave, you're given a list of your parents or your grandparents, or first your uncles and aunties, your paternal and maternal uncles and aunties, your first cousins, and that's it. They don't take into consideration the deep familial connections that we have. And we have union members. If a family member dies, they might not be closely related in the Western way. They're like a fourth cousin, twice removed or whatever. In Western eyes, that's not a close family relationship, but in our kinship societies, that is. And we have to, you know, when we have committee members or union members who have to rely on their leave forms to say that this was having to resort to dishonesty in order to be able to go mourn. That's one aspect that where we as unions can do better, is that we need our voices to be speaking up for little things like that, for those moments, and build upon each of those moments.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that's a really important topic that you're bringing up, and that perspective that Indigenous families and kinship is different than perhaps other cultures. And Nigan or Deborah, did you want to add anything more to that, or did that bring up anything that you want to share?
Yes, thank you. My name is Deborah Marrier, and I'm in British Columbia. Want to acknowledge the unceded Coast Salish territories that is a part of Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen First Nations. Thank you, John, for that. I just wanted to add a couple things. I work in the school system, and it's the elders or people or community say it takes 7 generations to make a difference. And it's not just, it affects all families. I see it in the school system with our young youth, our children, right? Even, you know, I'm a daughter of a survivor of residential school, and it affects not just one person, but everybody, right? And I just wanted to add to that. So miigwech.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, actually, that's really something really important to take into consideration. So thank you both for that perspective. And actually, I do want to mention that CUPE has a guide to reconciliation called Walking the Talk. Has some great advice for locals, and our team will put that in the chat for you now. Nigan, did you want to add something, or are you okay?
Sorry, just ignore my cat who's trying to make a guest appearance. She takes over scenes. So, anyways, okay. Every Indigenous person has trauma. Period. And what that means is that we are either a survivor in the schools, and I hope that everybody sits and just realizes that when we're sitting with someone like John, who's talking about his residential school experience, we are in a very sacred space, because John is talking about his childhood. He's talking about who he was at that time, and most importantly is that it doesn't matter if people learned a skill, if people had a good experience one day playing hockey. It didn't matter if people had a experience even with a good teacher or with somebody in the school. None of that replaces your parents. None of that replaces your language. Not 1 second of learning how to play piano replaces your relationship with the land. And, all of us have experienced that trauma that comes through the generations. And the ways that that's manifested is most oftentimes in words like, I don't speak my language, or I don't know what my clan is, or I don't know what community I come from, which I happen to deal with tens of thousands of students, Indigenous students, on the streets of Winnipeg. And let me tell you, every day is a struggle. All of us have that trauma. All of us are one step away from, frankly, going on a 4-day bender, because it is so hard. It is so difficult and so stressful to be able to, handle these stresses and these feelings of shame that we've been handed down for generations. And we could come from the most functional family of all. We could come from a survivor who somehow, worked very, very hard. If I talk about my grandfather, horribly violent person, but then finally turned it around at the last few years of his life. I only know the wonderful man. I don't know the violent man. But then that reverberates throughout my generation, so that when I do hear these stories, how do I reconcile the man that I love more than anything in the world, but that he perpetrated these terrible harms to my father, to my aunties, to my family? And it is this constant struggle of trauma in our lives all the time. So Canadians need to understand that, when you are an intergenerational survivor or you're impacted by the schools, it is something very sacred when people are talking about it. So we are very honored. We are very lucky to have someone like John and someone like Thomas, who is so brave, and that they believe that it is better for us to hear the stories than for us to not hear about them. But let me tell you, it's traumatizing. It's traumatizing for me to see my nephew here, my brother John. I'm assuming I'm older than you are, and oh, you look much younger than me. So. We're very lucky that John has done such hard work with himself that he can talk about these things in a positive way and then turn it around and become a poet and a musician. And, people like Dana and Deborah and myself, all of us who are, I think we're all intergenerational survivors. We are experiencing the echoes of that history, and that impacts our everyday life. It impacts our work, absolutely. And what it does is it makes us feel though there's this little voice in our head, and this little voice in our head is constantly saying to you, you're not good enough. You're not authentic enough. You are not worthy of love. And for what that turns out to be for often Indigenous men is we run away from love. We run away from our families and our communities. We often turn to alcohol. Same thing with often women, but often women have those children at home, so they're faced with the reality of having to do their work very seriously for the next generation. But often for Indigenous men, we don't get that opportunity. We oftentimes run, and we're taught to run. That's why one of the most biggest epidemics of our communities, one of the worst outcomes of the residential schools, is absent our fathers and uncles, who leave many of us behind, and many of us are hurt little boys and girls who just want to be loved by our fathers and our uncles. And so even talking about these things brings up a lot of trauma, right? So can you imagine what it's like to be in a workplace and to be impacted by that on an everyday basis? Because it's hard, and little things trigger you. I mean, little things make life difficult. And, luckily, and I make fun of this cat a little bit behind me, but, having that kind of companionship in your life means a lot. It means a lot to have, someone that you can learn how to love with. And, that's the kind of thing that impacts our lives as workers in workplaces. And so what that ends up being, and sometimes in workplaces, is a number of stressors that no one else is impacted by. you know, and a day like this week of brings up a lot of feelings, brings up a lot of emotions as we go throughout the community and we continue to do our work. So big miigwech to all of you. I feel very honored that I'm here, and I'm very honored. I was very moved by Thomas. So I just want you to know, by my uncle at the beginning, I sent him a message just because I was very moved by what he said earlier. So just miigwech to all of you for being here. So.
Thank you so much, Nigan. I think that it's really important that we keep that perspective in mind, and I think that actually leads well into, you know, why the new National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is important. So I actually want to turn to you, Deborah, next. You know, your activism on Indigenous issues in the labor movement has been truly inspiring, both as a member as well as in your current role as National Diversity President, Indigenous Workers. You have worked tirelessly to advocate for issues such as murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the Moose Hide campaign, Aboriginal Veterans Day, and of course, Orange Shirt Day. And as someone who has advocated for Orange Shirt Day for so many years, maybe we'd like to get your perspective on why this new National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is important for members to recognize.
Thanks, Dana. Orange Shirt Day is very close to my heart. As I say, is that my mom was in the residential for 14 years. Orange Shirt Day is, you know, started in 2013 with Phyllis and telling her story, and, you know, the impact, because our family didn't talk about it, right? We didn't have a clue, or we didn't have an understanding about what the residential school was. We heard little tiny stories, right? But today we hear more. It's out, the truth is coming out. And so when I heard about Phyllis's story, she's from Mission, BC, is that Phyllis went to school. Her grandmother made her a beautiful orange shirt, went to school, attended a residential, and it was taken away. Everything, her shirt, her identity, her language, the culture. And ever since that story, it just reminded me, and I wanted to know more about my family, about my mom. And of course, it was hard to talk about it. It was definitely hard to talk, right, about the orange shirt. And so what I decided to do is that I wanted to speak on behalf of my mom. I wanted to find out stories. And it took a long time, definitely took a long time. And so what I decided to do is I'm going to make a difference. And I decided to make a difference course in the union. And what I decided is that I'm going to educate the members in our union. And so I had a presentation and I shared. And that day in the last, I think 4 years ago, is that I wanted everybody in all of British Columbia to wear an orange shirt, to get educated and what it was and what it meant. And as you can see today, 2013, 7 years ago, it's starting. I'm able to, in my school, in the secondaries, that tomorrow we're going to educate some secondary students. And we're going to share about the orange shirt. We're going to share about Phyllis. And I'm also going to share about my family. And I think that's where it needs to start. And not just with my family, is with my grandson, because I am a CUPE. And when, you know, to explaining, we don't have to go into lots of details with our little ones, is the story is that, you know, I brought him an orange shirt and he wanted to know, why do I have to wear an orange shirt? And I basically said and shared is that orange is, you need to be proud of this orange shirt. And it represents your grandma. You don't need to know the whole story. Down the road, as you get older, you'll start to know. But when he went to the school, he was proud because he got to wear the orange shirt. He didn't understand the whole story, but he was proud. And the next day, he wanted to continue wearing the orange shirt. And so just those stories. And that's why Orange Shirt is so important. And as we can move forward, the National Truth and Reconciliation. So thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for that perspective. John or Nigan, did you want to add anything? Why is this new National Day important?
As a survivor, it's important that we're finally being recognized on a federal level. I remember in 2008 when we had the apology. Up until that point, I repressed so much of what happened to me. I knew that I had been in residential school, but I hadn't dealt with any of it. And it wasn't until the apology in 2008 that a lot of the memories started coming to the surface. On the 30th, as we go through this holiday, I'm very honored that we're finally being recognized. However, we still have a long way to go. I'm in Saskatchewan, and this is a very difficult place to be in. This is my ancestral territory, but I constantly feel like I'm behind enemy lines because of the amount of just everyday run-of-the-mill racism that occurs in this province. The sense of when I hear that word reconciliation, and I've been saying this quite a bit lately, is in this province, while we do have some amazing allies, the general feel I get as an Indigenous person in terms of what this reconciliation is, it's almost like a child being called to the principal's office and being asked to give an apology, and the apology being, okay, I'm sorry, can I go now? That's the sense of where reconciliation is right now. For me, that's what it feels like. It feels like we're just being asked, how long do we have to apologize until we have to stop apologizing? And that's a question I've been asked quite a bit, is, well, how long do we have to stop apologizing? The answer I've been giving is, well, when it stops happening. The abuses that happen in the residential school system, what happened to us is still continuing. And it doesn't necessarily mean a loss of culture on an institutional level as it was in the residential schools. It's the fact that we have communities that don't have clean water. It's the fact that there are more Indigenous children in care now than there was at the height of the residential school system. It's the fact that every time you see an Indigenous story online on social media, there's bound to be haha and angry emojis that pop up. And there's, basically, when people ask, how long do we have to stop apologizing? When you stop asking that question, when you stop asking when you have to stop apologizing and actually start making. Somebody had said, how did they put it? You need to see reconciliation as a verb, not a noun. I wish I knew who said that. That was a powerful when I heard that. You need to see reconciliation as a verb, not a noun.
Thank you so much, John. Actually, that leads really well into my next question that I have for Nigan, but I also want to point out to our viewers that we do have a statement that CUPE National has released for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So our team's going to put that in the chat for people to read later on. So Nigan, you're a professor at the University of Manitoba. You're also an award-winning journalist that has offered a critical Indigenous view on so many topics. To name a few, you've written articles on reconciliation politics, the 60s CUPE, and residential schools. You really understand the importance of how the legacy of residential schools impacts our current reality as a country. Can you share your thoughts on how that impacts Indigenous children and youth now? And how can CUPE members advocate for justice for them?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to answer that question in the second half, if that's
sure.
okay.
That's okay.
So the outcomes of trauma and is either one of two things: silence, I don't want to talk about it, or anger, how dare you make me talk about it, or this doesn't have anything to do with me, or how dare you try to implicate me in whatever. So that basically explains a lot of different factors in our community. It explains a lot of the shame. It also explains a lot of the violence and a lot of the self-abusing behavior as well. That's, addictions, suicide epidemics, issues around abuse in families and so on. And so, the fact is that we have this big, massive, underdiagnosed issue. And as someone who's gone through that period, let me tell you, we have such a lack of, well, first of all, if you're living on a First Nations, you have no access to things like therapists or psychologists. And never mind the fact that we don't also have the ability, our communal systems, our psychological systems, our cultural systems have been undermined by the residential school. So good luck trying to deal with many of those issues and having people who are competent. Luckily, we have amazing elders with amazing experiences, many of them completely uncertified with no university degrees, but are out there saving people's lives every day by doing sweats, by doing smudges, by just being there and having tea and listening to many of our stories that we're experiencing. And so, we have that we're surrounded by these amazing individuals in our society. But frankly, to get to a moment in which one thing I wanted to address in my first answer was that, it's not as easy just to say to an Indigenous person, go find a therapist, because frankly, we have such a lack of therapists who understand the issues around residential schools and intergenerational harm. And let me tell you that I have yet to ever meet a non-Indigenous therapist who knows what they're talking about, and he has any clue of what our experiences have been. And there is such a small amount of Indigenous therapists that can support us, that they're often overburdened. And can you imagine, like my father is Murray Sinclair, and so like my father is an amazing person who many people depend upon, but we all realize that my father for 6 years listened to the stories of residential school survivors, the most brutal stories possible. And he tell you that since he's finished the TRC, life has not been easy for my father, and people are still demanding things on him. But the fact is that he had to listen for 6 years. And of course he chose to do that, and he's a strong man. But the fact is he had to carry those 6 years of stories, and he's still carrying it today. Yeah, and there's no therapy to deal with that. It's unprecedented. And so, for many of us in the workplace, there's not just easy just to say, oh, just deal with your EAP, just take a little bit of time, take a week off, like that is not the solution. We have this massive issue of trauma in the country, which is undiagnosed and frankly, almost serviceable, other than those elders that I talked about earlier, often uncertified, unpaid, doing the wonderful work of saving our lives. One of the things that I think is also undiagnosed is the trauma that Canadians are experiencing at the moment, because Canadians are unprepared for this conversation. They have not been taught about this history. They're not aware. They're not aware of this fundamental truth of the country, which is that while Indigenous children were taught that to be ashamed of themselves, Canadians were taught to feel superior. They were taught that, Indigenous peoples were taught that they were worthless, pointless, came from useless cultures, and that Canadians were taught that they were, perfect, and that they came from civilized places. They brought all the development and civilization to this place, which is all both lies. Both of those are lies. It's not just that Indigenous people were taught lies, but also Canadians were fed a lie as well, that they were perfect, that they were superior, that they brought all the development. They were the problem solvers. And so Canadians are traumatized as well, because we've interrupted that narrative to say all that stuff that you learned about Canada being this maple syrupy sweet place, and you're being somehow rightfully here. Like John's talking about life in Saskatchewan. I live in Manitoba. Let me tell you, man, you and I's experiences in these places, we often deal with people who think that they earned the land legitimately. They think that they came here from wherever other territory they came with, and that somehow that earns them a right to have a place. And in the case of Colton Bushy, to shoot a kid in the head. In the case of Tina Fontaine, to use her body and then toss it aside. Nothing. I mean, the fact is that we live in a society where there's such a profound amount of racism, but there's also tremendous solutions here, and they're Indigenous led. People, like Deborah talking about her work with bringing orange shirts. I can tell you every single day in our society here in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, and in Saskatchewan, we have people every single day coming up with the solutions. Orange shirts is one solution in a major set of solutions that we need to take steps along a journey together, because the fact is that Canadians are also traumatized, and we need to also express that generosity to them as well. Now, to get to what you asked me just a minute ago, which is about the impact on families and children, I happen to, oversee the development and the professional development of tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples in this community here in Manitoba. We have one of the largest on-campus communities at the University of Manitoba, so I get to see all different walks of life. And let me tell you, one of the most tragic things to watch is Indigenous students who are going through trauma and being so far away from home. So can you imagine what that must have been like to be a young person in residential school? Because, when they're in the city, there are many different vices that can distract you and that can soothe that pain, but they're not often productive. They're often taking you away from your studies. They're often taking you off the path. And so I get to watch many of these students thrive, and I also get to watch some of the hardest journeys these students are taking. The bottom line is for us to always be there for our nieces and nephews when they need them. We need to call them our nieces and our nephews. We need to never give up on them. And we need to treat our young people as the sacred beings that they are and work doubly hard, triply hard, because we are in an egregious situation. We need Indigenous young people more than ever to thrive and be the people that they need to be to get beyond this issue of residential school. But we also need to face the reality that they are experiencing the most amount of pain, the most amount of struggle, the most amount of violence in their own life. And so therefore, an egregious situation needs an egregious solution. We need to double down on our young people, work extra hard. And I know that many of us, we're already stretched. We're already in a position in which we're doing often 4 times the job as everybody else. When I was a teacher, I was expected to teach not only kids, but my colleagues, my administration, and to be the personal consultant of every single teacher and administrator in my school division on everything Indigenous. And if I didn't answer emails, people were like, oh, you're snobby, or you're a jerk, or how dare you not respond to my personal emails because I need some help in this school over here. So I was doing 4 times the job as everybody else. An Indigenous person in a workplace is often doing multiple jobs that no one else is expected to do. And so, but the problem with what I'm asking you is another layer, which is we need to double down on our youth. Like take that extra step and never give up on our youth. And when our youth, Rosanna Deerchild, if we're quoting other people, used to say to me, I never say no when a young person asks me to read them a book. And so what she meant by that is when a young person asks you to do something, you listen and do everything you can, even if you are stressed and tired, because it's worth it, because you'll be saving a life. I have a young man that I help. I wasn't able to help him the first time around. He's my student in an intro class. He's an Anishinaabe guy from eastern side of the Lake Winnipeg. He comes from Sagging First Nation. I'm not going to share his name because he's struggling right now with meth. And after his first year of university, it was so hard for him that he ended up on the streets addicted to meth. And I didn't get to help him the first time around because, I thought I was helping him, but I maybe wasn't helping him enough. And now I help him. I take care of him. I give him clothing and food, and I support him in the shelter downtown. I keep an eye on him. He messages me all the time, and I go down and I never say no to him. I don't give him money, but I never say no to him. Whatever he needs something, he wants to get into rehab, I'll take him there. If he wants to try to clean up things and he needed surgery on his foot, I took him to the emergency. And, that's the kind of job that we're going to do to get through this. And it doesn't mean it's easy. It's probably the hardest thing that our generation has to do is to try to work extra hard for our young people. Because our young people, different to us, is we had our parents who were coming out of the schools, yes, or coming out of but they still had connection to community. For many of us in urban environments, those young people have had almost 2 generations away from their community. And so therefore, they're really struggling more than we were even in the 1980s and 90s.
Thank you, Nigan. I think it's really important for us to remember and our viewers that these issues are still very, very much here in the workplace and everywhere, really. But I do want to wrap up this part of our event by giving you all some time to offer some words of action to our audience. So what is one action that CUPE members can take now to advance truth and reconciliation? And maybe we'll start with you, John.
One word: listen. When we as Indigenous people are speaking, if we're making ourselves vulnerable enough to share our stories, if we are struggling and we feel comfortable enough to share what's going on with us, listen, not just hear us, listen to us. And don't, maybe all we need is just to be able to say what we're feeling. We're not looking for answers. We're not always looking for a solution to something. I know that I've had people, as my brother was talking there about, go to therapy. I went to therapy, and I left feeling worse than I did going in. And so when we as survivors, we as traumatized people are speaking and are sharing and are giving of ourselves, opening up, making ourselves vulnerable, because we're opening up old wounds. Listen. And if you can find something in yourself, if even those little steps like I was talking about, to make someone's day a little better, that's what we need to, that's one way to go forward, is just, listen, and don't try to explain over while listening. No, just listen.
Thank you so much, John. And Deborah, we'll hear from you next.
One action. Wow, this is tough. This is so, because there's so much. What my would be is that Indigenous members should be at the bargaining table, and we should have bargaining language. I know it's 2 words, 2 actions, but those are the main 2, is that we should have Indigenous members at that bargaining table and having in a bargaining language, and no barriers. Miigwech.
I'm not as involved in the union as John and Deborah, so my answer, my answer has shifted over the past year or so. I used to say to people, the most revolutionary thing you can do is teach your kids. And because, spend time with your kids, help them understand the things that you're learning. But what I've realized is that we live in a time in which we have some of the most competent young people in the world, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I mean, young people are, because of really brave work of teachers and advocates, educational assistants, you're seeing more young people aware of residential schools, the TRC calls to action, Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. Like, it's amazing to me that my daughter's friends know all of that stuff. Like, what I was doing when I was 15? It was like, not that. A lot more TV, a lot more wasted time, and a lot of hanging outside with my friends actually is probably pretty much what I was doing the whole time, playing a lot of sports. And so, they're out organizing climate change marches. And what my daughter did today is she went and smudged the residential school here in the city. And she walked there with her friends. They didn't have any school trip. They just did that on their own. Like that's amazing. That's amazing and so what I'm actually telling people now is learn from your kids. Spend time with your children, talk about these issues. What you'll find is that your children probably know a little bit more than you do, or as much anyways, and that you collectively together can come to a responsible family ethic of sharing knowledge, learning, standing up to racism together, because there is power in collectivity. We know that as a union. We know that as brothers and sisters. We know that when I'm sitting here and I'm getting to hear from others, I came in pretty tired today. This is like my 8th or 9th event that I've done today. And, I feel very energized because being around other people who are going through this and experiencing this and speaking out, and, being able to spend time with Deborah, Dana, and John, I'm very energized as a result, and being able to see a union and see a group of people who believe in one another and will stand together. That's really ultimately what we're searching for, is reconciliation's about moving together. It's not about agreeing. It's not about giving up on your own positions or not having opinions. It's about going, how will we move together when we disagree? Do we not turn away from one another? How do we find a solution and not give up on one another? That's what reconciliation ultimately is. Because the hardest thing in the world is it's easy when you're agreeing, but it's difficult when you're disagreeing. And how do you grow together in a peaceful, kind, and generous way?
Thank you so much for that. I know everyone here is really appreciative of everything that our speakers have offered today. I also want to mention that there is a tool that has been created to help CUPE members take action at the bargaining table. A bargaining guide has been created by CUPE for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and our team is going to put that in the chat now. So please take a look after that webinar and make sure to share that widely. That's one way that we can sort of maybe get members to advocate for that day within their locals. And now it's time to take a couple questions from our audience. So don't forget that you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen in order to type your questions to us. But maybe we'll start with one. A lot of times when people are new to these issues, one of the questions that gets asked is, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be an Indigenous ally but is just starting out? And I know that I know that there's lots of good advice that we can give today. So maybe we'll start with you, John, again. Is that all right?
I'll go back to that answer I gave before. Listen, follow the lead of the Indigenous people who are speaking. Follow the lead. Don't override. Don't ride the room. Don't take up space that could be filled by an Indigenous person. And be supportive. In our culture, being considered an elder is a very powerful thing, but being an elder's helper, in Cree we call it oskapeosak, being that helper, that's an honored role. You're sitting beside the elder and you're learning. That role is important to help out. You're helping win the healing of the people. So listen to the Indigenous voices, and when they ask for help, when they ask for your assistance, follow their lead.
Thank you. And Deborah, do you have any advice for allies?
Thank you. Again, yeah, absolutely listen. It's, yeah, I'm not going to repeat. John said it all, and I thank you. So, yeah, very important. Listen. Rich.
Thanks, Deborah.
Read, and read some more. Read people like The Inconvenient by Tom King. Read Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talega. There's some really great memoir coming out. Read John's poetry. Check out all the writings that are being done. They're there for a purpose. Check out, I find some of the most innovative and exciting writing is not actually done in books per se. Some of it's done on blogs, some of it's done on chat rooms and in media and things like that. There's really some great stuff that's out there. But then also when you read, let it sink in, share it with your friends, talk about it. Like, there's nothing wrong with talking to your friends about things that you're reading and thinking about, because more information is good information that you're sharing. And, even if you radically disagree with some of the positions of the people that you're reading, it's good to engage with other people and find out, like, what is it that you're disagreeing about and what is it that you're thinking about. And watch documentaries are always good. And then, of course, talk with real people, get every opportunity that you can to hear an Indigenous speaker or hear a survivor. You are very blessed that if you get a chance to hear a survivor speak, like John, or like people like Geraldine Shingoose, or there's dozens and dozens of very brave survivors who are out there sharing their story. I can think of the honored Theodore Fontaine, who did The Broken Circle, and how beautiful that book was. And I encourage you to read about that book, to hear about his experience and think about him. He spent his whole last third of his life trying to teach Canadians about his experiences so that they would never happen again. He believed so much in the power of love and kindness that he was willing to go through some of his own horrible, terrible experiences to relive those things so that Canadians can learn. And he didn't do that because he was making $1 million. He didn't make any money off that book. What he did is he gave a space for that those of us can point to him and say, what an amazing uncle that he gave us that gift, that he gave us the belief that love can overcome all things, I remember spending time with Basil Johnson. Basil Johnson stayed at my house before he passed away. And of course, he wrote the famous Indian School Days, and he was also an advocate. But he was in town for the the very first event of the TRC, and I got to spend time with him for those 3 days. And you know, his speech that he gave that night at the TRC in front of hundreds of people is he said that love is the only thing that let me overcome the fact that I was abused and raped, and my language was challenged, and my life was challenged, and the fact that I became self-defeating. I started to hurt myself in lots of different ways. It was my love with my partner that I learned to love myself. And that learning to love myself was the hardest love I've ever had, because I had to overcome all of those things collectively in my heart. And I had to come, you know, I could say I love you to many people, but I could never say I love you to myself. And the day that I said I love you to myself was my first step on becoming who I am. And he told me that, and you know, brilliant and beautiful. And that's what I think is ultimately the power, you know, being able to share that kind of story, hear that story, read about that story, and then talk about it. Realize, let it feel, let it come inside of you, because you know, yes, we are all humans in lots of levels, but we don't have the same opportunity, we don't have the same experience. So being able to be empathic or to share others' experiences is a very rich time to be able to grow as a person.
Thank you so much for that. You know, and I'm just thinking now, all of you actually work in education. And a question that's being asked is, how can we talk about, you know, this new National Day and reconciliation in residential schools with the youth and children? And maybe Deborah will go to you first for this one.
Thank you. You know, education I always look is important. Also is having oral education is important too, listening to our elders, listening to our aunties and uncles, right? Now for in the school system, as being a, you know, an Aboriginal youth care worker, there are barriers. There are barriers for young people. And I always say is that, you know, a lot of our young people have difficulties reading, having difficulties having a learning disability, right? And I think that's really important is that knowing their strengths, knowing what they are able to do, because we want to make sure is that of like someone would say, and I'm not being disrespectful, but one of my family's members stated is that, you know, you should be reading the paper, you know, you should be reading a book. And I'm not saying anything, but you know what? You don't know the story of where that youth came from. You don't know the story of, you know, the disability, right? And so sharing the truth and reconciliation at our school tomorrow, we're having a presentation. And so the teachers, myself, we're all, first of all, what we did is that the staff had a teaching in the Longhouse yesterday. So all the staff went into the Longhouse and we had a presentation. We had elders there. We had people in the community and shared about the residential school, not just stories, but the history, where it came from. Right. So then the school decided is that, okay, the next step is that, what are we going to do for the students? Right. There are some students that we asked, do you know what a residential school means? Have you heard of it? Have you learned it in school? So what we're doing as staff is that we're going to have a presentation. We're going to share about stories. We're going to have some pictures. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take it with all the grade 8s, grades 9s, and it's going to be an all day. It's a start. It's a start about Orange Shirt. And as we move forward, what's going to take place is the National Truth and Reconciliation, because now it's the time to share about the truth. And like someone said earlier, we're not going anywhere. We're here to stay. So make witch.
Thanks, Deborah. John, I know you also work with youth. What do you think? How can we share this with them?
Well, speaking from my own where I'm coming from, I'm an educational associate in an elementary school. I'm one of the few Indigenous educational associates in our school division. I'm also, I think I'm the only male Indigenous educational associate. So I've been very lucky and honored that in the schools that I've worked in the classrooms I've worked in, I've had admin and I've had teachers who are allies in the true sense, in that they're not just checking off, the tokenism box. I'm not just a token Indian in the classroom, but they've approached me, and actually with tobacco, and saying, if you teach this, it's going to mean more than if I teach it. And so when I've been honored that I'm considered somewhat of a knowledge. I don't like the term knowledge keeper, because this isn't mine to hold on to. I'm a knowledge carrier. I have the knowledge that I've been given by my elders. I carry it to pass it on. In Cree, we call a teacher kisnamagyo, that person who teaches. So I've been very honored that I get that opportunity. And to teach this to the younger generation, to these students, it's not just a one-day thing. I do this all day, every day in the classroom. If a teacher's teaching and they say a word, I will take the moment, I'll write that word in Cree on the board. We have a Cree word of the day where, it's on a whiteboard in the hallway where the kids can see it, and it's written phonetically so that they can try speak it. When I'm asked to provide these cultural stuff in a classroom, I always take that opportunity to remind people, once upon a time, this was against the law. This was not allowed. We weren't allowed to do this in classrooms. So my experience every day in the classroom, I use that as a teaching moment to share our culture, to share our experiences, and to remind not only those students, but those teachers that, once upon a time, this was not allowed. And for 150 some years, this was never taught, and we've started to teach this. Well, this year we lost a very, very powerful man. He was a man named Victor Thunderchild. He passed away of COVID-19. He was the first educator in Saskatchewan to lose his life to COVID-19. I would not be doing what I am doing right now if it wasn't for this teacher. He was my grade 10 Cree teacher. I was this scrawny little 16-year-old street kid in a black leather jacket and a Metallica t-shirt walking down the hallways, and I was an angry young man. He's the first one who invited me to the drum. He's the one who invited me to sit at the drum the first time. That's where it started for me. This year in our school division, this last school year, we had the first Cree immersion kindergarten class in our division. And 2 weeks before Victor passed away, I had the opportunity to run into him in a parking lot. And I was there with my daughter, and I got to thank him. And I told him, you know what, 35 years ago, I sat in a kindergarten classroom, and I was getting in trouble for talking Cree. And I got to sit in that classroom and have little kindergarten kids come up to me and ask me in Cree, "Kisnamagyo, matewichian, teacher, can you help me?" And sorry,
It's okay. Take your time.
I got to thank him for that. And he got to see that before he passed away. And the fact that, and for a long time, he was the only teacher in our school division, it seemed, that was wanting our culture to be in those classrooms. He was a high school teacher, but what he did went through the school division. And what I do today, I wouldn't be doing if it wasn't for him. And so for those younger generations, I'm continuing on what those lessons he gave, those teachings he gave. I'm not keeping them, I'm carrying them and passing them on. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. No need. Thank you so much, John. I think this is also a good time to to mention that, this is an event that can bring up a lot of feelings for a lot of us. And if we do have any Indigenous members that are watching tonight, just to remind them that, we want to put the Indian Residential School Survivor support line in the chat, and our team will do that right now. So if you do need someone to talk to, please take advantage of that. And thank you again, John, for sharing that. I know it's not easy to share those stories, and we really appreciate that. And I hope everyone here knows that, the depth of what is being shared tonight. So we'll also go to you, Nigan. How can we
Yeah,
share this
I
with
just
you?
had something small to add. I just want to add on what John's adding. I happened to take a look through the attendees tonight, and I saw that my auntie is here, and my auntie Thel is here, and she's listening out there. So I just want to tell you how much I love you. I actually told my auntie Thel the other day. I went out of my way to tell her how much I love her because what John was talking about there is just something so profound. The one thing that was that we were taught as Indigenous young people, and frankly, residential school, or sometimes often in public school, and frankly, sometimes because of our parents weren't strong enough, or they were hurting themselves, or for whatever reason, is saying the words "I love you" and saying the words that you matter, and saying the words that I will give you, I will do everything I can for you, is one of the most revolutionary things that I've ever experienced in my life, because I got to see that through many of the people in my family. And it's taken a long journey for people like my father, who's really struggled to show love. But yet I've always known that he loved me, but he's never really said it. My father is very comfortable with saying to 600 people in a ballroom in Vancouver that he loves me, instead of saying it to my face. And that's kind of what often Indigenous men are in, those situations, in which we have difficulty showing that love and talking about love. And so when you see it, and many of it was given by our aunties and our grandmothers and our sisters, I happen to be surrounded by amazing women. So I swear that, all of the women who were in my life saved my life, my sisters particularly. And they saved my life. But one of the people that saved my life is my Auntie Thel, who's on this call, because she never gave up on me. Like, even though I was really angry for many years, I was really lost for many years. And many of our young people are really angry, are really lost, or just confused. They don't have someone to turn to be able to, understand that going through life in a world in which that is very built on a lot of hatred of Indigenous peoples, particularly young women, is hard. And so I'm very lucky in that I've been surrounded by these amazing women in my life, and some of them are non-Indigenous, who some of them were teachers who just never gave up on me. And I happened to have a grade 3 a non-Indigenous man who was just a beautiful, beautiful man in my life. And later in my life, I had another non-Indigenous man who taught me my very first course on Indigenous literature. I was so lucky to have Gordon Johnson, who's teaches at Trent University. Just amazing people that I get to be surrounded by, that worked so hard for me. And now it's my job to do that work for others and to be able to assist those others. And that's what the word miigwech means. So the word miigwech doesn't mean thank you. It means I will hand, or I will give forward, or I will give to, because the word miigwe is the verb in that word, which means I give. So when you say miigwech, what you're promising is it's like a commitment. You're saying, I will give it on. The gift that you have given to me, I will give it on. And that's one thing I love about the language. John was talking about the language there, but the one thing that I really love most importantly about the language is that it teaches me all the time to be a better person, to be involved with the community, to be interacting with the earth around me. And, I learned that from all of the love that I've gotten up to this point. It took my whole life to learn what miigwech really means. And now I'm 45 years old and only scratching the surface of what that word miigwech means. And that's just one word in the language that every day becomes an ethic.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Nigan. And thank you to all of our speakers tonight, and taking the time to really engage with CUPE members' questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this event as well. And I would actually like to ask Thomas if he can end us off with a few good words, because I think we need that elder medicine to close us off for the evening. And I think he's just
Okay,
going to
I'm
get to
on.
the unmute. Thank you.
Mute myself. Okay,
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
okay. Hey, watch me taking our bill, this and cast more so and do them. Miigwetsin Vitagi for allowing me to listen to the young people here, especially John, and especially yes, Sinclair. I met your dad a few times, and he's such a wonderful man, and he really looks serious all the time.
Yeah, well, you got to see him early in the morning when he hasn't had coffee, and he's just cranky.
And sometimes he's chewing a chocolate bar, but he's really a wonderful person to listen to. I remember my grandfather before my ending of my during that time when I went to residential school. After I got out, I went to see him after 3 years before he passed on. I went to apologize to him. And I said, apologize for not saying nice things to you because I blamed him. And I blamed my mother all those years. Why you let me know? But I asked a question. Help me to know this. So you went back to childhood, how I was taken away, and my mother and my grandfather were overpowered by 3 people there, RCMP and the Indian agent and the man in black. And she's so friendly. But it's a lot different when you're in the residential school, that 4 walls. We've seen everything in the boys' dorm. Sometimes they're 75 to 100. We see what happened to them. And so many things that we see. I asked for that. I asked my grandfather for forgive me for what I said to you negatively. Escusa, he says. Escuta, man. Get the bathroom. He said, Escusa na ka. You'll find that place for you. You'll find out where you're going. It'll be rough, but you'll get there, he said. And he was right. But I'm still a squabewas. I'm a squabewas helper to the community and helper to the elders. That's what I love doing. I love playing with my chainsaw. And I build a sweat lodges for the old people, the elders. I do sweat, I gifted sweat. I went 4 days fasting. And when I spoken the community spoken that I'm responsible for, it's not mine. Anything that I carry, I'm just a caretaker. When that time comes, when my daughter needs it, and pass it on to the next member of the family. A little bit that I know. I'm so happy you guys are educated. But my education for going to Nuchimikande, where I learned how to build these lodges in the bush. That's where my education is. I write a little bit. My wife here, she's educated. She's a policy analyst. She talks a lot. That's okay, but in the bush is quieter, but it's all good. And I encourage you. I remember this young man, John, said, listen. But when I'm in the bush, the elder said, listen. You have to watch and do it. Once you listen, and then you're watching and you know what to do, how to build a sweat lodge. That's why the 3 things I learned me in the bush. Like in the trees, sometimes small trees, big trees, they have spirits in them. Go hug that tree once in a while. You'll feel that vibration, ask Mother, the love of the Mother Earth, the love that tree you're hugging, you talk to them. Some people think I'm crazy, but the trees are listening. The wingbirds, call them. They'll respond to you, especially the Canada geese. That's my favorite food. Also, I'm a carbo. I'm a moose clan. I don't eat my clan. Bugo carbo I eat, and it was 4-legged ones. Sometimes in the olden days in Uchimikande, on the trap line, you'll see the skull of an animal hanging on a tree. My grandfather said, see that skull of that caribou? He fed my family. They say thank you for that animal. That's what I learned in the bush. Be respectful to one another. I have 19 children, so I have lots to listen to, lots of them to listen to. As long as my battery doesn't go dead, I'm okay. You know, that's a machine that I have been slapped around residential school, but I could still listen to them. Now I'm new fourth generation, fashionista. My great granddaughters, another generation. It's ongoing all the time, what we're doing. There's no ending of our work. That circle, there's no ending in circle. There's no ending. We always keep going. Sometimes we start over, we still keep going. Teach the young ones how important that they are to us. You are my teachers. Miss Vegi, and all my teachers. I said, thank you for allowing me here. Now, give me going to switch for midnight. Maybe I'll see you guys later. Watch it.
Thank you, Thomas, and I wish everyone a great evening.